Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. عصر بخیر بانوان و آقایان. خیلی خوش آمدید. And I'm also saying hello to our live stream web viewers. درود بر شما بینندگان عزیز. It gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Ahmad Karimi Hakkak, Professor of Persian at the University of Maryland, United States, who is an authority, or may I say the authority, on Persian literature worldwide. He is an expert on Persian classical literature, but has also widely written on various aspects of modern Iranian literature, modern Persian language literature, and indeed his interests stretch from poetry all the way up to prose literature, and his 1996 book on Persian poetry is really the Bible, if I may say so, of the scholar of Persian classical poetry. It's an absolute must, and it's a great honor for us to be able to have Professor Karimi Hakkak with us tonight, and I'm very pleased that you have come to join us, and also I'm very happy that once again our viewers over the internet can be with us, and the Manchester Iranian History Academic Network has really great pleasure in welcoming Professor Ahmad Karimi Hakkak tonight. So this is a very special lecture. It's a one-off. It's not related to the series that you might have been following, which is taking a break tonight on the interface between Russia and Iran. And for those of you who are interested in our series, which has been running for quite a while, the last one in that series will take place next week. However, not at the usual time, but on Friday. Friday, the 15th of May at 5:15, so at least it's the usual time, our series will come to an end with a talk by Professor Abbas Amanat of Yale University. But at this moment in time, once again, a very warm welcome to you, Ahmad.
Thank you.
And without any further ado, I hand over to you. And I would like to draw your attention, however, Professor Ahmad Karimi Hakkak has kindly prepared a handout, which each of you should have one in front of you. James kindly distributed them. That will be necessary as we go along. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's been a joy to be with you, and I'm very excited about your project, about what you're doing, about celebrations and all kinds of theatricality of power and so on and so forth. It's wonderful to be in an academic environment. I see Dr. Alan Williams is a specialist not only of Rumi, but also of ancient Iranian languages, and his work that promises to be really the final, I hope it will be the final, the ultimate translation of the spiritual couplets is in the works, and I, for one, am extremely excited to see it out in print. Thank you very much for being here, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be with you. It's wonderful to be with a larger audience through the new media. Streaming, is that what it's called? Streaming, whatever. It's wonderful. My vocabulary needs so much improvement in that area. But anyway, fortunately, that's not the area where I claim any authority. What little authority I may claim is in Persian poetry, particularly as we view it across a diachronic line, that is through time. In other words, a history of Persian poetry. And I'm interested in the history of Persian poetry, in historical views of literature, because I hope the presentation today will talk to it, will address this issue of how important it is to write a history of Persian poetry that no longer begins with political history. unfortunately, and for the entire duration of modernity, political history has dominated the concept of history. So much so that history of the arts, cultural history, literary history, and all of these have been seen as subcategories of political history, which is unfortunate. One aspect of that is, or expresses itself in the way the canon of Persian literature and Persian poetry in particular has been periodized, put into different periods. It seems as though people think somehow as soon as Reza Shah's coronation happened, or Amir Ismail Samani's, or whoever, something happened to literature. It doesn't. There may be relations, of course, intricate relationships among political power and poetic power, but of course there are so many variables and so much complexity there that one ought to be able, logically speaking, to speak of a history of Persian poetry not in terms of in the shadow of political history, but as a thing into itself. And that's what I'm trying to do. That's, in fact, almost everything that I've written in the past 30-some years go to this idea of let's see literature as literature, and let's look at it from inside out rather than from outside in. That's why my effort has been directed at putting texts, literary text, poetic text in this case, at the center of our observation, and see what those texts tell us about everything else. After all, if we are talking about the history of poetry, one would have to, you would think logically, place poetry at the center. But for so long and for so many, for the entire duration of modernity, really, this has not been the case. Unfortunately, historical treatment of Persian poetry began at a time when Iran, the modern country of Iran, found itself in dominating the entire realm of Persian language and Persian literature. That gave rise to a desire that may have been natural, instinctive, human in a way, but it distorted the history. So much so that because of their effort, people like, let's say, Muhammad Taghi Bahar or Muhammad Qazvini or Ibrahim Pur Dawood or whoever, or Firuzan Far, these scholars who looked at the entire 1,000 year of Persian poetry began to confiscate it all in the name of the country of Iran. Whereas so much Persian poetry had been produced in India, so much Persian poetry had been produced in Afghanistan, what's today Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and in the Ottoman Empire, and in all kinds of places. And now, once again, this poetry is being produced in Los Angeles, and in London, and in Stockholm, and in Paris. The diaspora has happened. For all these reasons, I would like to suggest that we need to separate two things. The country of Iran, a political entity with its own history, etc., and Persian language with its own territory, with its own realm, changing in both cases, but not the same. So while at times the Persian language and Persian poetry seem to have moved in tandem with the ups and lows, the fortunes of the country of Iran, or the Iran Zamin, the larger entity of which modern Iran is a truncated part, but they are not one and the same thing. And they are not one and the same thing ontologically. One is a political thing, the other one is an aesthetic thing. It's an aesthetic phenomenon. Anyway, so for all these reasons, I have a preamble that I'm going to read to you, and then go into the text, and with you look at the text to see how close textual readings of Persian poetry may modify our view of Persian poetry, so that in the end we come up to the end with less distortions, fewer distortions, a more realistic notion of of Persian poetry and its movement through time. So one place where I begin, let's say in 892 of CE, Common Era, and mind you, I have changed all of my dates to the Common Era because to bring the Hijra calendar, both solar and lunar, would introduce complexities that I don't want to deal with, and I am speaking to Westerners who may know nothing or little about the Hijra calendar and its varieties and so on. But the Gregorian calendar is going to be my touchstone for all of the historical markers. In 892, Amir Ismail Samani finally overthrows the Safavids of Sistan and the Zaydids of Tabaristan and establishes a kingdom, a veritable, practically independent kingdom in what's known as Khorasan, the northeastern part of the Islamic realm. He might well have declared independence from Baghdad and worked out a new fate, a new destiny for that province and the realms around it. He didn't. Instead, he decided to make a dynasty that would really nurture Persian as distinct from Arabic. And mind you, I'm saying as distinct, not as against, because obviously by this time, all of Iran, including Khorasan, was a Muslim territory. These people believed in Islam, practiced the Muslim religion, not of some of the types that we see today, but made it and updated it time and again to bring it in line with the demands and the dictates of their own times, and so on and so forth. For whatever reason, the Samanids also wanted to emphasize continuity with pre-Islamic Iranian history. As such, they started developing genealogies for themselves that went to Bahram-Gur or Anushiravan or various other Sassanid royal households. So what I'm saying really here is that Bukhara, as their capital, gained a lot of legitimacy as one of the birthplaces of Persian poetry. Ismail and then Nasr, his brother, and the rest of them really made a place, a locus, shall we say, for Persian poetry where it was nurtured, little by little. It's not to say that at this time, let's say the end of the 9th century, the beginning of the 10th century, there was no Persian poetry. There was, but it was not substantial. The tradition was just beginning to happen, and these people practiced, and their practice gave depth and complexity, greater complexity to the tradition itself. So I'm saying all of this because I want to, again, emphasize the separation I think we should take into account between political history, history of political power, and history of poetry that is an art, a linguistic art, a language art, so to speak. That's why Iran, which even before Islam had a book called Avesta and all of its subcategories, Zand and Pazand and so on, and Khorde Avesta and all of this, became even more logocentric by adopting the Quran as its holy religion. And so the question we deal with is all of these people started creating a poetry that's well worth our attention. Looking back over this product and this period of gestation in search of how it might relate to succeeding epochs of Persian poetry, early modern, now I'm switching back to late 19th century, early 20th century. Early modern historians of Persian poetry, men like Bahar, the textual scholar Qazvini, traditionalist literary critic Foruzanfar, and so on and so forth, as well as many other native and nationalist historians and chroniclers of Persian poetry who were by now largely citizens of the country of Iran, intent on appropriating all of this accumulation of 1,000 years of literature in the name of only a part of it, that is the modern country of Iran, thereby leaving out Afghanistan and Central Asia and Ottoman and the Indian subcontinent and so on and so forth. So because of that, certain distortions began to creep into their historical attitude about Persian poetry. So what I begin with is what I call Nowruz She'r Farsi, a new day for Persian poetry. Really is not a moment such as the moment of the change of the year in Iranian calendar, or even a decade or a generation, but processes that stretch over history, overlap, and one gives way to the other, and another dominant discourse appears. Within that context, the first dominant discourse that I identify, and you can see in your handout, is a kind of worldly literature, worldly poetry. This worldly poetry is mindful, of course, of religion, of death, of ajal, of all kinds of things that connect people to their being and not being, and so on and so forth. But they celebrate life as it is. So let me read a few lines, an excerpt from a poem by Rudaki. His Persian is شاد زیبا سیاه چشمان شاد که جهان نیست جز فسانه و باد زامده تنگ دل نباید بود و از گذشته نکرد باید یاد من و آن ماه روی هور نژاد من و آن جعد موی قالی بوی من و آن ماه روی هور نژاد etc etc. So when I say, and you've got the English in your handout, item 1 in your handout, as we look at the beginning two words, shadzi, it's an invitation, it's a command, it's a recommendation, it's an exhortation, right? An addresser, a speaker, is addressing the reader, right? Shadzi. What kind of an address is that? It's really like live life for today. And Rudaki is famous for that. Notice that he connects to something like the Islamic religion to which he subscribes. Man an mahruy hur nejad. Huri itself, in the form of an angel in heaven, is an Islamic creature, part of Islamic lore. But still, he wants his huri, a beautiful woman of this world, of this time, of his own form, and so on and so forth. So the poetry is pretty much worldly. As we see from the beginning two words, the poem of which this excerpt is conceptualized rhetorically as an invitation, advice, exhortation, and a recommendation to good life. Live joyfully. It is at once pleasant and forceful, commanding and encouraging. It seems also to be touched by philosophy, incorporating a concept of pleasure into the way you live life. And this recalls the centuries previously where the Greeks came to that part of the world. And the two notions of Aristotelian philosophy of life and the Stoic philosophy of life, one affirming pleasure as part of life, the other denying and living in deprivation, begin their rivalry. Now, in the Islamic world also at this time, there's a lot of Greek influence, Hellenistic influence, so to speak. As such, what you see is this amalgam of philosophies are working through this little poem, this little innocent poem inviting us to live joyfully. It seems as though it's touched by philosophy, reinforced by the observation that it's mere legends. The world is mere legends blowing in the wind. It moves to negating the thoughts of the past and the future before presenting an example of the speaker's own lifestyle. Mano an, me and, I and. It speaker's own lifestyle, which revolves around satisfying the senses with both earthly and heavenly archetypes of perfection and beauty. The mosque, the moon, the houris of heaven. Above all, the poem advances an exemplary way of thinking about man's relationship to love, beauty, and pleasure. The musk-scented, moon-faced beauties of the last couplet of my excerpt seem to come straight from man's original home, the heaven, the skies, paradise, the celestial realm, while the word hurnejad points to a Quranic articulation of the same creatures. So, with this poem, it seems to me, we are at the heart of a discussion about the thrust of much of early Persian poetry. You look at this poetry, you read this poetry, and of course there's death. Of course there's sorrow. Of course there's all of this. And yet there's a very strong sense of carpe diem. Seize the day, seize the moment. Work towards worldly pleasure. The world is young. The poet is young, or young at heart at least. Life is an arena in which you can contemplate moments of beauty and pleasure in an eternity of chaos and confusion that confound the imagination. Given all that, this command is clear and unequivocal. Shadzi, seize the moment. We can see the spirit of Rudaki in so many poems of this period. So many poems of this period and the subsequent dynasty. The dynasty changes. The Samanians, in effect, are defeated by the Ghaznavids, who move the capital from Bukhara to Ghazne, and still the spirit of poetry remains the same. It still continues in a worldly manner. Rudaki himself complains about old age. مرا به سود و فرو ریخت هرچه دندان بود. And yet, he indicates in the same poem his love of life, even though he knows he's going to die someday. He also writes poetry in praise of wine, and not only in praise of wine, in a kind of forensic way about ways of making wine, how we make wine and how we enjoy wine. But more than that, the succeeding poets of the Ghaznavid court. Now we are in Ghazne, and now there's Mahmud, whose fame and power is much more than Ismail or Nasr, the Samanid kings. And every time he needs cash, he plunders India. He goes into northern India, plunders some of the Hindu or Buddhist temples, becomes rich, and brings the wealth to his city, Ghazne and Lahore, and 400 poets, the legend has it, serve at his pleasure and at his court. So one poem that I highlight as my item number 2 is one by Manuchehri. It's a lovely poem. I love this poem. And it's a poem about sharab and kebab and robab. So it's very percussive, isn't it? The percussion of sharab, kebab and robab. Read the English and I'll read you a couple of lines of the Persian. آمد شب و از خواب مرا رنج و عذاب است ای دوست بیار آنچه مرا داروی خواب است. And then that turns out to be wine. And he shows not only wine, and wine is not just something to drink and get drunk. In fact, you don't get drunk. It's part of a ceremony. It's celebrating life. It's getting together. Through the poem, I argue, and I'll argue with you here, it shows a glimpse of a social structure that these poets were a part. Unfortunately, these modernists who looked at this history, because their own concern was the people, a category called the people had now emerged as people who should have, as the entity that should have political power. So they kind of looked at this poetry and they didn't even see the elitist nature of this poetry. It's very elitist. Not everyone in Ghazni can have, not everyone in any time before modern times could have wine. Wine was a very expensive thing and there was prohibition on it. And only kings and those people who consider themselves above the law could use and consume it and be gladden their hearts by it. So notice this line, and I'm going to read in this in English. 3 things ought to be there when free men make an assembly. در مجلس احرار در مجلس احرار 3 چیز است و فزون نیست. Now, who knows the meaning of the word ahrar here? It means the free men. And it doesn't mean men free from labor. It means men free from the din of the madding society. It's these people who can seclude themselves and sit down in the presence of the king and drink their wine and derive pleasure from it. در مجلس احرار 3 چیز است و فزون نیست. بین هر 3 شراب است و رباب است و کباب است. Once again that percussive thing comes in. And look at what he says in 2 lines later, the penultimate line of the poem. Notebooks you see in schools, sweetmeat in the marketplace, and backgammon is meat for the rabble's ruin. دفتر به دبستان و نقل به بازار و نرد به خرابات خراب است. He is separating himself. This is not an assembly where scholastic things are happening and you learn about the world. That's a different place. That's the Dabistan. That's in school. And material transactions, you go to the bazaar. This is an elite assembly. And worst of all, kharabat kharab. No one knows what he means. I'm speculating. Probably means some place where women, inferior creatures that they are there, right? It's like these men are separating themselves as the elite of the society. Probably gambling, probably some sort of, sexual favors, whatever. He is separating them. So notice how selective he is in this thing. ما مرد شرابیم و کبابیم و ربابیم خوشا که شراب است و کباب است و رباب است. In the end, it's that which is cause for celebration. Now, my late friend Jerry Clinton has written an article, a part of his book is on this poem. And let me read a block quotation for you here. These are Jerry Clinton's words. There, that we are to take wine here as meaning good fellowship, as well is indicated by the subtle carpe diem of what answer to the former, that is death, and by the mention of young men, javanan. The theme is brought to the fore in Bait 6 with the introduction of the lute, that is robab, conviviality, kebab, good food. The next two lines serve to add to the pleasure-loving character of the group by separating them from the bazaar, the school, and the kharabat kharab, the rabble's ruin. And the last line provides an emphatic and decisive conclusion to the poem. Usually, in these classical traditions, the closure is very strong. You see that in English literature as well. Shakespeare with his monosyllabics. So long as this can live, or so long as men can see or can live, or eyes can see, so long lives this, meaning his poem, and this gives life to thee. So it's or Sadi where he says, چنین گفتو همی گفتو میرفت دو دشت سر چنین از پایان عشقی پسر. Or Rumi when he says پس سخن کوتاه باید و سلام. End of words, end of language. So all of these, because these poets consider themselves pretty much prophets, people of vision, and so we need to take note of that as well. What I'm trying to get at is a text, once you press it, once you get the juice out of it, releases other information, not aesthetic but social, political, perceptual, and all kinds of biases of the society, and so on and so forth. So, to generalize a little bit from the two examples I've given, let me say the following. In content and theme, as well as in its imagery and expressive system, and these are important, these relate to the text itself. From its very beginning, Persian poetry reflects, at least in its basic thrust, a constantly shifting set of socio-political environments as it moves through many of the stages characteristic in the evolution of the poetic traditions anchored in natural languages. It's only natural that language changes, therefore poetry changes. Initially, it may present personal observations or reflect the courtly milieu we have examined here in fairly simple, straightforward lyrics. Where hardly do you ever get a conceit here, or a complicated image or a symbol. It's all similes and simple metaphors. Notice where in that other poem about Amir going to Bukhara, he says, Mir mah hast u Bukhara asman, mah suya asman ayat hami. Very simple. You make an equation. You say Mir equals mah, Bukhara equals asman. So the skies would be more beautiful when the moon is up there, right? Therefore, Bukhara would be more beautiful with the Amir in it, with the king. It's very simple. We are seeing a poem in its beginning stages, in its period of gestation, what I call the period of gestation. Now, This begins to change with the demise of the Ghaznavids, and not because of it, but along with it, and along the rise of Sufi monasteries and hospices, the khanaqahs. This begins to change. Political power now shifts to the hands of the Sufis, of the Sufi masters, the mashayikh. I have identified at least 4 historical processes that contribute to a change of this discourse. Number 1 among them is a change in the nature of the lyric poetry, the ghazal, in the Persian language. Now, it's the genius of Persian language that it does not have a pronoun for male and female. It does not have male and female in the third person plural. So when you say oo, it's not clear whether you're referring to a woman or a man, which used to give these people the possibility of writing a poem that at the same time may refer to their beloved, whether it's a man or a woman. The designation is female. It has the appearance of a female, but it may be man or woman. And to the mamduh, which means the king, the person patronized, because this ghazal is panegyric and qaside along with it. So what you have is the poem posturing as lover, addressing or writing about a beloved, the poet as a citizen, as a courtier, appealing and praising the king, and now gradually a third entity, God, appears there as the beloved of man. That's because of the development of Sufi discourse, because of the Gnostic influence there. That's one thing that happens. The second is a period of is a process of interiorization of poetic assets. Let me give you some examples. In the Shahnameh, which falls into the afaqi or worldly discourse that I have been talking about with Rudaki and Manuchehri, we have a bird, a big bird. She is called Simorgh. She's a big bird, a real big bird, the size of 30. She it is who heals Rudabe, the mother of Rostam, after she has given birth to this huge monster of a baby called Rostam, and we have a first case of cesarean C-section, and she then rubs her feather along the cut she has made in Rudabe's side, and it heals fine. She's a healer. She also is a friend of Rostam's family, that is Zal and Rostam and their descendants. She speaks to them. She speaks to Zal. She speaks to Rostam. She helps Rostam finally find a way to kill this invincible Prince Esfandiar. But of course, she also warns him that whoever kills Esfandiar is going to come to an ignominious end himself. Nonetheless, she does those things. And above all, as I say, she is corporeal. She has a body. Now, switch. 150 years later, Attar writes the Conference of the Birds, Mantiq al-Tayr. And he too brings in Simorgh. Not the same Simorgh. This is not a bird. It's just a presence. It's a godly presence. God or a demigod or whatever it is, something between God and man. He's the end, the ideal creature that all these birds seek. آینه این حضرت بی آفتاب, Attar tells us. It's like a mirror. And the 30 birds that ultimately make it to Mount Qaf, they see this bird, and in the mirror that she is, they see their own reflections. How does this happen? And why does it happen? Let me give you another example. Rostam. Who are his enemies? Who does he fight? The thieves and demons and dragons, right? The dragons are beautiful, but he fights them. Now compare him, Rostam, with Shaykh San'an, again in Mantiq Tair's Shaykh San'an. Who is his enemy? His own nafs, his own lower instincts, his own lower soul. He has to overcome that lower soul so that that upper soul can begin to show itself. It's an interiorization. Something from the outside is taken inside. Something corporeal is turned into something ethereal. The last example, and I'm going to connect to this example, and that's in my outline 3. This is from Sana'i. And Sana'i's years, which are untrustworthy but by approximation, are 1055, 1130. So the latter part of the 11th century and the beginning decades of the 12th century. He has heard about Jam Jam or Jam Jahannama. The Shahnameh has it. It's much like the Holy Grail in the Christian lore. It's a real jam, and a king, be it Alexander or King Khosrow or Jamshid, look into it and they see the affairs of the world. But it is out there. Okay? Now, Sana'i interiorizes it. به یقین دان که جام جم دل توست, he says. You will hear many tales about Jamshid's cup. And in each telling, something added or left out. قصه جام جم بسی شنوی و در آن بیش و کم بسی شنوی. And then he says, know this for certain. Jamshid's cup is your heart. The seat of joy or sorrow is your heart. به یقین دان که جام جم دل توست, مستقر سرور و غم دل توست. It's no longer a jam, it's your heart. But not you. It's the Arif, the Sufi saint or Sufi Salek. He is polishing his own heart, meaning cleansing it of all the bad things, all the things that bring gham, and putting into it all the things that bring joy, surur. Okay? When you desire to view the world, you can see all things inside it. جمله اشیا در آن توان دیدم. He ends up saying. Again, the same process is happening. I'm using texts, ladies and gentlemen, to tell you about change of poetry. I'm not saying that dynasty changed, and therefore, new poets appeared and they started saying this. I'm saying there is a social context, of course. The courts have lost to the Sufi hospices, and now kings go on their knees to kiss the hands of the great Shaykh. But in tandem with that, poetry begins to change. Not necessarily at the same time, but in the same process, in the same series of processes. So when you have this thing, what you have is a re-articulation of the assets, a reinvestment, a kind of, shall we say, move from the worldly to the unworldly, from the afaqi to the anfusi, from that which deals with the world out there, external, objective world, to the world within. And that's what Rumi says is the greater of the two worlds, the world within. So what happens is the equivocation of this. So write an equation, and you have jam jam equals my heart. And you see what kind of a change is taking place. So that's a third event that happens in the 12th century, through the 12th century. A further thing happens in that century. It's a very eventful century. Two other poets, Nizami out in the northwest, and Attar in the heartland of Iran at that time, today in the eastern part, okay, Neyshabur, have come about. of age, and they are doing their own things. And what Nizami does, he plants love at the center of the whole universe. This is an important contribution. The story is that he has written his Makhzan al-Asrar, his book of advice, modeled after Sanai's Hadiqat al-Haqiqah, and now he wants to turn to a love story. And he produces some anxiety in his own circles. So a friend comes to visit him at night, and he says, you have such a treasure as Makhzan behind you in your youth. Now in your 40s, I hear you're going to write a love story? A love story? And that before Islam? Of those Gabrs, of those bad Zoroastrians? And Nizami says, sit down. Let me tell you what kind of a story I want to write. And he tells his story. And by the time he finishes, the friend says, oh, come on, write it as quickly as you can. I want to read it. What does he say? This stretch happens at the beginning of Khosrow and Shirin. It begins by saying, فلک جز عشق محرابی ندارد زمین جز خاک عشقابی ندارد جهان عشق است و دیگر زرق سازی همه بازی است الا عشق بازی. Love moved to the center stage. In the Shahnameh, love was not there. There was Sauda, there was Hawa. But love was basically, you made love to make children, right? Like good Christians did many centuries later. It's like, yeah, the body is not worth paying attention to. You need to polish your soul. That's a medieval, dictum, right? And so it is who really presents love as an emotion, as a human emotion, at the center of everything. And the stretch that I'm not going to have time to read ends by saying, چو اندیشه کنی از راه بینش به عشق است ایستاده آفرینش. If you think along the lines of vision, and this is an important binesh. Binesh comes to oppose danish. Danish is scholastic. It's an accumulation of information and wisdom and so on and so forth. That's danish. That's what Avicenna did. That's what a good mathematician does. But binesh is a kind of enlightenment from within. It catches you at a moment, it reveals everything to you, and it leaves you illuminated. From Hallaj, through Sohrawardi, through all of these, went through the same process, binish. So when Nizami says, "Chora andishe koni az rah binish," when you think along the lines of or on the basis of binish, meaning vision, be'ishq ast istade afarinish, the whole creation stands on love. The love of man for God is an important thing. It's a Quranic dictum as far as these guys are concerned. Okay? Notice. Where do I have the Quranic thing? Number 4? Okay. Yeah, I can't find in my own thing, but okay, I don't. Okay, thank you. I'll use yours. Okay, now this happens as a result of the efforts by the commentators of the Quran, and it's a very important development. The Quran is a book of 300 and some pages, and a good Muslim that you should think of every ayah, every verse as of the same value. It would be blasphemy to say, I like this verse better, or this verse is more important than that one. But the Sufis do. They play with some of these verses, especially those verses that really have the potential for interpretation. The verses that are layered. Listen to this. Allah nur samawat wal ard. God is the light of the heaven and the earth. This is my number 4. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is as if there was a niche and within it a lamp, the lamp enclosed in a glass, the glass as it were a brilliant star lit from a blessed tree, an olive neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil is well nigh luminous, though fire scarce touched it. Light upon light, God doth guide whom he will to his light. God doth set forth parables for men, and God doth know all things. This is in the Quran, Surah 24, verse 35. This is the kind of verse a Sufi would love, a Sufi interpreter. Light and a niche and a glass and all of these. And Ghazali gives a whole chapter, a whole book, Mishkat al-Anwar, to this niche of lights, he calls it. And in it, he explicates, he exercises his exegetical genius on this verse by giving us all the possible meanings. He says, for example, let me try to be precise here. Okay, he says, he begins his plunge into the esoteric by distinguishing not just between light and darkness, but between a physical or terrestrial sphere for light on the one hand, and a spiritual or celestial sphere for it on the other, distinguishing many gradations in each sphere. According to him, in the above verse, human faculties or spirits find their correspondence in the niche, the glass, the lamp, the tree, and the oil. 5 different things. The niche is the sensory spirit. It's like seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, right? Sensory. Whose lights come through eyes, ears, nostrils, etc. The glass is the imagination, for it's made out of opaque substances, potash, right? But is clarified and refined until it becomes transparent to the light of the lamp. The lamp itself is what can be called the intelligential spirit, which gives cognizance of divine ideas. The tree is the rational spirit, which typically begins with a single proposition. It branches into 2, the 2 becomes 4, and so on and so forth. Ghazali works through series of equivocations, just like Sana'i. His was a simple one. Here's a much more complex one. A series of equivocations that apply this complicated conception of light to the Quranic verse. What is symbolized by the niche, the glass, the lamp, the tree, and the oil are the human faculties. The niche being the sensory spirit, the glass, imagination, the lamp, intelligential, the tree, the discursive, and the oil he equates with transcendental prophetic spirit. Prophets have it only. Absolutely luminous and clear, which reveals the word of God to human beings. This, ladies and gentlemen, does not happen in the Arabic language. The Quran is in Arabic, but it's the Persian commentator who can write in this way, because the act of interpretation also hides within it the act of translation. It's translated from Arabic into Persian. It's changed, as you often see in translation happens. That's probably why, Christianity becomes universal, because it moves out of Aramaic and ancient Greek and Hebrew, and so it becomes a different language, a more mysterious, more with more potential, more interpretability, shall we say? So what I'm saying here is really how it is that these things really accumulate what Nizami does, what happens in the ghazal, and what happens in the interiorization process, and what happens. One more example of this last kind, and that is the my hand in hand, my handout. It's number 5. In various tafsirs, the anonymous tafsir commentary, which we know as the Cambridge commentary, in Surabadi, in Abu Bakr Atiq, and so on and so forth, we have the story of creation. It's a covenant. A covenant happens there. Listen to the Quran. This is from the Quran itself. Surah 7, verse 172. When thy Lord drew forth from the children of Adam, from their loins, their descendants, and made them testify concerning themselves, saying, Am I not your Lord, who cherishes and sustains you? They said, Yea, we do testify to this. Lest ye should say on the day of judgment, of this we were not mindful. So you can't deny it on the day of judgment. God is your Lord. And the way he asks the question is interesting. Alastu birabbakum? Am I not your Lord? It becomes an existential thing. It's not like, do you choose me? Am I not your Lord? Acknowledge it. And when they acknowledge by saying Bala in Arabic, or Bali, which means yes in Persian, that covenant covers not just Adam and Eve, but you too, and me, and everyone else. Because all of us are in that mass of clay that God is addressing. Can you imagine what the Persian commentators could do with this? They really had their field day with this one. Everyone turns into a love at first sight. God is the beloved, man and all of his descendants are the lovers, and we are in love with God. Sana'i says again, Sana'i is the real devil of the piece. He says, از برای یک بلی کندر ازل گفته است جان تا ابد مرد بلی اندر بلا افتاده است. So we brought a lot of catastrophe and problems with for yourself by saying yes to God. Now, compare this and use this as a template to unlock the mystery of the structure of all those love romances in Persia, beginning with Fakhruddin As'ad, who himself was not a Sufi, so far as we know, and then you come to Nizami, both Khosrow and Shirin, and Layli and Majnun. Then you go to Khaju, Humayun and Humayun, and 1,000 other parables of the same. On the day of Alast, man testifies to being a lover of God. He then commits a sin and is driven out of the garden. That's the beginning of Hijran. That's the beginning of separation. All of life, his as well as ours, until the end of history, becomes a process of struggling, clawing your way back to that paradise, in the hope that someday you'll get it. The same pattern happens in love story after love story, in romance after romance in Persia. People want to claw their backs to their beloveds. So it's one of those things. This when you really begin to make sense of the whole world for all of time, right? And from here on, I take you through a collection of four different ghazals that basically, in a small text like ghazal, give you this story or glimpses of it. For example, Rumi, the ghazal that opens the whole of the Divan Kabir or Divan Shams, is ای رستخیز ناگهان وی رحمت بی منتها ای آتش افروخته در بیشه اندیشه ها امروز خندان آمدی چون بر مستمندان آمدی چون بخشش و فضل خدا. Now, by the time Rumi comes along, this is 13th century, the tradition of divan making has taken hold, and everyone knows what is going to come first. Not the poem that the poet wrote in his youth. It's not a chronological thing. It is a poem that begins with Aleph and ends in Aleph. And this one does. ای رستخیز ناگهان وی رحمتی بی منتها. Aleph at the beginning, Aleph at the end. He knows this is going to be the head of his divan, and so he makes it into munajat, into a prayer to God. But what he says is he's really complaining of separation. The same things happen in the spiritual couplets with the ney, with the reed flute, which Alan has written about. The whole story is one story, the story of how man laments separation from God, which again is a way of propagating the Sufi notion, philosophy, if you will, right? Time and again you come across this tendency to articulate this, or visions of God in Gnostic ghazals is very important. These visions are really very important. At some point in one of the ghazals, Rumi makes a kind of journey, upward journey, a space journey, if you will. بر چرخ سحرگاه یکی ماه عیان شد، از چرخ فرود آمد و در من نگران شد، چون باز که برباید مرغی به گه صید، بربود مرا آن مه و بر چرخ روان شد. در تن چو نظر کردم خود را بندیدم، زیرا که در آن تنم از لطف چو جان شد، زیرا که در آن مه تنم از لطف چو جان شد. در جان چو سفر کردم جز ماه ندیدم، تا سر تجلی ازل is the same as Alast جمله بیان شد. And so on and so forth. So what you have is another retelling of that lament of separation, that wailing sound. حافظ finally در ازل پرتو حسنت تجلی دم زد، عشق پیدا شد و آتش به همه عالم زد. Same are the articulation of the same thing. So God it is that manifests itself on the day of Alast and makes love an all-embracing and all-inclusive drive in human beings. As things begin, time begins to pass, you have various articulations of the same thing, of the same impulse in so many poems. This is what I call a story of change in Persian poetry that does not depend on who was the king and who was writing for whom and in which city it happened. Unfortunately, these people who have told us the story of Persian poetry have really made it as if there was a Khurasani period, and an Iraqi period, and an Indian period, a Hindi period, and a modern period. There's nothing like that. What it is really is just a whole notion of change in the taste, change in the environment, change in the system of poetic expression. By the time we come to Hafiz, and that's where I'm going to end my story, we really have all of these strands coming together in some sort of re-articulation that I call taqtir atifi, or emotional distillation. For Hafiz, the Shahnameh is not important in itself. What's important is the type of man who appears there. So, when he says, شاه ترکان سخن مدعیان میشنود، شرمی از مظلمه خون سیاووشش باد. You know that he's alluding to the story of Siyavush. He was a prince, the son of Kaykavush, who, after being accused of raping his stepmother, and he proved his innocence, he hates war, so he passes into Turan, which is supposed to be the enemy of Iran, and there he says he repulses, he loathes war and doesn't want to make war. Unfortunately, he's so talented that everyone feels jealousy towards him, and eventually the king's brother, Garsivaz, says nasty things, badmouths him to the king, and the king orders him beheaded, and he is beheaded. Notice حافظ شاه ترکان سخن مدعیان میشنود شرمی از مظلمه خون سیاوشش باد. The king of the Turks is affected by the words of the badmouthers, of the pretenders, of the liars. Shame on him for the injustice he did to Siyavush. Shah Turkan is and is not Afrasiab. Ultimately, it's Hafiz's own beloved. He's accusing her of listening to his rivals, Ragib. Ultimately, Siyavush is not Siyavush, it's himself. And it's not, I don't mean Khaja Shamsuddin Muhammad, I mean the persona in the poem. The man, the I in the poem, the speaker in the poem. So that's what I mean. He's distilling the emotional, the emotion involved is shame. Somebody should feel shame. The same shame that Afrasiab in another historical, worldly, external, objective context should have felt. But here's an emotional relationship. My beloved has done me wrong because she listened to my rivals who said nasty things about me. Notice when he says, ما قصه سکندر و دارا نخوانده ایم از ما به جز حکایت مهر و وفا مپرس. We have not read the stories of Alexander and Dara, his Persian nemesis and whom he killed and destroyed. Do not ask me anything but the story of love and fidelity. He has read it, he's telling you in the same poem, because he knows that the story of Alexander and Dara is the opposite of Mehr و Wafa. It's the story of wrath and enmity and all kinds of things, right? Bad emotions, harsh emotions. So, but what's important to him is ultimately the emotion, not the story itself. Every story, every episode, every confrontation, every end of a story has an emotional charge for him. And it's that charge that is featured in his ghazals. I can give you so many pieces of evidence. But by the time we come to the 15th century, and Jami, the last of the great classical poets of the Persian language, dies, within a decade, the Safavids take over and turn Iran into a Shia state. At the same time, territoriality becomes a concept of identity, a part of the concept of identity. There's a Mamlekat Iran or Mamalik Mahruse Iran. Within a few centuries, 2 centuries, Iran is an encounter with the West, and modernity happens. And the way modernity happens is by looking to Europe. The same tradition, the same august tradition that awed and instigated admiration in everyone is now seen as defective, and Persian speakers have to look to the West to learn what literature really is and how they should really write. Modeling happens. I've told that story in another book, so I won't bore you with that. What I want to end on is how it is possible, I think, to write a history of Persian poetry that is separate, related, mind you, but separate from political history, in which kings and viziers and amirs are not that important. It's these poets, and the poets live in dynamic times. Little by little, three things operate through every poet, every poetic mind. First, there's his own psyche, his own, shall we say, chemical makeup, which is entirely a social entity because it expresses itself in language. Remember, we have experienced Freud. So there's pre-linguistic things, that's the stuff of our dream. The moment we want to tell our dream, we're in the world of language. And in the world of language, everything is articulated in binary ways, right? So you've got a night and a day. It's not a matter of the diminishing and the increasing of light in a period of 24 hours. It's two opposites. You have man and woman. You have good and bad. You have all kinds of things. So that's the psyche. Then there's the assembly around the poet. Sometimes it's 400 people listening with the king at the head of the assembly. Sometimes it's two people whispering to one another, or one man wondering what another man was doing when he wrote this particular poem. That's the fraternity or the sorority around it. The assembly, the contemporaries, people who live at the same time, even though they're in different regions. And then there's that accumulation of tradition. The Persian language at the time of Rudaki was simple. The poetic language, the poetry is simple. As I said, and I can demonstrate by so many examples, it is similes, it's metaphors, hardly ever a symbol or anything like that. But by the time you come to Hafiz, it's so layered. Language is encumbered. Words carry within themselves this traces of past usages. Even simple words are no longer any simple. So when a poet, we don't know who he was, let's call him Abu Hafs Soghdi, says آهوی کوهی در دشت چگونه دوزا او ندارد یار بیار چگونه بوزا. This چگونه is not an encumbered word. It's like saying, how do you do this? Tell me about it. There must be a way. So when you apply that line to your circumstance as an expatriate Iranian or Persian speaker, you should realize that some Ahui Kuhis are doing fine in Dasht. You are mostly in that category of exiles. You don't have to die just because you're outside of the country, because you can carry within you the spiritual, emotional aspects of the language. And so you really are not in exile. I'm not in exile because I don't care about Zayanderud and Damavand. I care about this. This is what I've given my life to. Why should I feel in exile? But by the time you come to Furuq Farrokhzad and she says, چگونه ایستادم و دیدم زمین به زیر دو پایم ز تکیه‌گاه توهی می شود و گرمی تن جفتم به انزوای پوچ تنم ره نمی برد. That چگونه is a negative, it's laden with negativity. چگونه ایستادم, why did it happen? It's not really how, it's why. How come? How did it happen that I neglected this thing? So every word usage, every word combination, every poetic image, every passage describing a poem becomes laden with encumbered with some sort of load of tradition. A history that enables us to talk about the poetry of 1,000 years ago as well as the poetry that was written the day before yesterday is to take all of these into consideration and move through layers and layers of history, peel those layers to eventually get to the core issues in the text, and then start exfoliating, start going away from that center which you have located and getting all the way to what is the social structure in this poem, and why is Hafiz's poetry so emotional? Why does it speak to us so emotionally? We all love the Shahnameh, but we don't open it all, and we don't open it, and we don't tell fortunes through it, do we? But Hafiz is so laden with these emotions that we are laden with, we're burdened by as well, that we see something of our own desires and needs and limitations and concerns in whatever he says. That, I would argue, is really trying to get to a better history of Persian poetry. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Ahmad, thank you very much for this wonderful journey that you took us on, opening our eyes to those dynamics of change that, as you have convincingly shown, must be studied from different angles, and an angle that has been neglected so far by those who have, in a way, founded the school of literary criticism, and on whose shoulders, of course, in a way, we still stand, have to be challenged. And I'm very grateful to you for this, to have presented this challenge that you are mounting to us. And I think this will have also raised quite a number of questions amongst our guests here in the room, and potentially perhaps also amongst those friends who have been following us over the live web stream. So if you agree, the floor is open for questions.
With pleasure, thank you.
Alan?
Well, yes, thank you very much, Ahmed. That was wonderful. And I sense a great book in gestation here, because obviously you're going to write this new literary periodization, so to speak, distinct from the historical periodization that you have problems with, so to speak. I wish you all the luck to be able to write it, because it's an enormous subject, and it seems to include everything that ever happened in Iran, in a sense, before and after the period you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with my interest in pre-Islamic Zoroastrian literature, I'm reminded how much what you were saying about Rudaki, for example, rings bells with me, and there is a huge transition that goes on in this period. And I noticed from the selection, the beginning of the first verse of the first extract from Rudaki begins Sha'adzi, live joyfully, live in happiness. And then the last line of the last selection from Hafiz, when he abandoned all pretense of a happy heart. So we've gone from the celebration of happiness to the abandonment of happiness. That's very interesting. And I wonder whether it's, in a sense, not just the interiorization of the epic, but the interiorization of what was the Zoroastrian message of happiness, which is absolutely central to Zoroastrianism from the Avesta itself. It's the interiorization of that message within a kind of Abrahamic tradition, not within an exclusively Iranian, Indo-Iranian tradition, but taking on board the whole Semitic scriptural tradition that is so beautifully exemplified in those quotations from the Quran that you gave us. And that seems to be a fulcral point, doesn't it? And in your talk, when you got to those passages, and if we could, my question, if I may come to it, is that in that light verse, in the Arabic, which seems to me to be sublimely poetic, whether or not they could explicate, whether exegetes explicated the Arabic in Arabic is one question, but it is certainly a most intensely poetic passage where the Quran says, an olive neither of the east or the west whose oil is well nigh luminous. That line, I mean, it breaks away from the narrative into a profoundly poetic, I'm aware that one doesn't use the word poetry of the Quran, but I can say that it is deeply poetic. But one thing it doesn't mention, neither in that passage nor in the passage that follows, the quotation from Surah 7, is the notion of love. Because, and if I may say, you kind of slip that in when they say, when God says, Alast bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And then there's the parenthesis, who cherishes and sustains you. And the answer is, na'am, is yea, we do testify. But the notion of love is something that Persian, if you like, Persian Sufi commentators from Khorasan bring to it, don't they?
Absolutely, and thank you for noticing everything you say. Has my admiration for your line of thinking. Yes, the movement from have a happy heart to moving away from a happy heart is the Sufi condition. Is from a non-Sufi to a Sufi who defers everything to that final union with God, if you will. But your idea of love, its presence or absence in the Quran is also very perceptive. The Quran never uses the word ishq, nothing of the ishq. It's only hub. بَلَّهَ يُحِبَّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So it's one kind of love, the recognition of the emotion that one feels towards someone when you hub someone, when you love them. But this love, in the way that Majnun loved Layli, is entirely a Persian invention, even though the legend itself is an Arabic legend. It doesn't matter. The point is, yes, you're right. The Quran is ultimately poetry, really. Only if you are a man of faith and you've been told that Quran is not poetry, you begin reading it as non-poetry with poetic qualities here and there. So, in a way, what the Sufis are hiding beneath the selection they make of certain verses and their inattention to other verses is really this notion of getting rid of what Rumi calls vasite. من نخواهم فیض حق از واسطه که هلاک خلق شد این رابطه. So every Sufi seeks his own personal, individual relationship with God, because when God says Alast bi rabbikum, it's not the clay who answered, it's every one of us who answered Naam or Bala or Bali. So it is a very highly personal thing, which really covers the gamut between what happened to someone like Hallaj, had to be killed. To say an al-haq is obvious kufr. To those Sufis, many of them Kharaqani, Bastami, etc., the Khurasanis mostly, who kind of moved at the edge of kufr, not really declaring themselves out of religion, not declaring themselves God or in any relationship with God, but alluding to the same and leaving room for hermeneutics, for interpretations. Is this interpretation taking it to the original intention, or is this interpretation preparing it for the next turn in the century? You can say the same thing about the United States Constitution or Magna Carta. Are these writ in stone and forever the same, or are they updated? You see this contestation right now in the Islamic Republic of Iran as well, between those who believe in certain corporeal punishment that Quran doles out in the case of men and women, for example, and those who bring in the demands and dictates of time, iqtizai zaman wa makan, as they call it. So again, we are in this murky area of no interpretation or interpretation literalism or eternal interpretability. But thank you for noticing all of that. Yeah.
I just want to pick up one thing,
and
that is, how can one possibly think of, for example, a poet like Rumi composing the Masnavi from 1260 without taking into account, for example, that his homeland, Khorasan, had been utterly destroyed by the advancing Mongols in the early 13th century, and that Baghdad itself was utterly destroyed in 1258, and the Abbasid regime was
collapsed,
and had to reinvent, the Islamic world had to reinvent itself.
Yeah.
I mean, this suffering is something going on in gross human terms all around these poets. This is a time of terrible loss. And that melancholy is not just an internal thing, it's also a present social reality.
Yeah. Again, good question, and you should probably provide an answer for this for all of us. What I can contribute possibly is his realm, again, is not afaqi, it's anfusi. So while the world may be burning in hell, it's the Sufi that needs to find his own individual salvation, his own personal way to God. And ultimately, that is the thing that is the difference between a happy heart or an unhappy heart. Rumi can have a happy heart because I don't think he's bothered. We don't even know if he knew about the Mongols. He probably did. But again, in the assembly that he sits, that is not the question. In the assembly that he sits and utters his poems, it is man's soul in the form of the lament of the reed flute that speaks, and a general notion of how are we going to get ourselves to some sort of salvation.
Any further questions? Then I might briefly abuse my position to ask a question. The audience doesn't know that, but we of course had the discussion a little bit about the topic and about the title, and initially there was sort of going actually beyond this change from the epic to the Gnostic all the way to modern times. And I just, not having had the chance to hear this, but in the spirit of those discussions, I would like to ask you, where do you see the contemporary Iranian poets in that development at the very moment that we speak, or maybe in the last, say, 20, 30 years?
Yeah. No, again, a very good question, and a question that takes us into another system, another change in the system, another systemic change, shall we say, in Persian poetry. What I can say, Oliver, is definitely poetry today is not the same, not even in definition, in ontological definition or epistemological definition as the poetry of the classical or medieval times. It is now a social product that needs to take notice of certain variables out there. There is a land of Iran, a country of Iran, a political entity, and its fate is different from that of Afghanistan or Tajikistan, to speak of the other two Persian-speaking lands. And so while we speak of Persian poetry as being one thing, really that is a Persian poetry that is cosmopolitan and not territorial, and this is the Persian poetry that is territorial and as such needs to take notice of political power in its own ways, not the way, let's say, Ferdowsi or Farrokhi or Ansari or Asjadi or anyone else were affected by Mahmud's glory, but in a way that it determines their own lives. So with that in mind, what I have done, I've basically, again, diagnosed this notice of change as a process rather than change as a sudden thing. The current articulations of the arrival of modernity in Persian poetry is everybody was writing out like Rudaki or Ferdowsi or Mawlavi, which now, from their perspective, if they don't want to distinguish to act in this model, they all look the same. They all have a certain rhyme and follow a certain meter, etc., or certain varieties of meter. So they're metric. They have a kind of very pronounced beat and musicality to it, and they want to seek something that's more mellow, more accommodating of modern lives, and certain outward signals. We don't want to travel in caravans anymore. We don't. So let's not in poetry travel in caravans. Let's take a plane. And so Farrokhzad writes Ufuq Amudist wa harakat fawware bar, because she's going up. So or Sohrab Sepehri, who has something of a mystic in him, wants to modernize his mysticism by deleting metaphysics from it. So in his articulation, it becomes آب را گل نکنیم. A sort of an environmentalist concern. The beauty of the nature. He comes close at times to Sa'di because Sa'di really is a social mystic as opposed to these very unearthly mystics such as Sana'i, Attar, and Rumi. So what he says is, where Sa'di said, برگ درختان سبز در نظر هوشیار هر ورقش دفتری است معرفت کردگار. Even a leaf can tell you about the knowledge, give you knowledge of God. He says, in one poem, he claims prophecy, and people deny him. And he says, زیر بیدی بودیم برگی از شاخه بالای سرم کندم گفتم بنگرید آیتی بهتر از این میخواهید. میشنیدم که به هم میگفتند سحر میداند سحر. سر هر کوه رسولی دیدند ابر انکار به دوش آوردند. And then he punishes them. ابر را نازل کردیم تا کلاه از سرشان بردارد. خانه هاشان پر داوودی بود چشمشان را بستیم دستشان را نرساندیم به سرشاخه هوش. جیبشان را پر عادت کردیم خوابشان را به صدای سفر آینه ها آشفتیم. So the punishment he doles out is to make us inattentive, not noticing all this beauty around us, not noticing them, noticing it as a way of reaching God, but noticing it for its own sake. In the same poem he says, در کف دست زمین گوهر ناپیدایی است که رسولان همه از تابش آن خیره شدند. It's this earth that's beautiful. It's not that those skies and the heavens and all of that. So there are transformations of this sort. Farrukhzad, who really ushers in the whole female discourse in Persian poetry, begins with having her own doubts. گناه کردم گناهی پر ز لذت. There's pleasure and there's guilt, a sense of sin. I have committed sin. I've slept with a man. But that's when she was let's say 22 or 24. By the time she reaches 30, and it's amazing how rapidly things change in her life and in her career. She writes Fath Baq, where she says, سخن از پیوند سست دو نام و هماغوشی در اوراق کهنه یک دفتر نیست. سخن از گیسوی خوشبخت من است با شقایق‌های سوخته بوسه تو و صمیمیت تنهامان در اوریانی و درخشیدن درخشیدن اوریانیمان مثل فلس ماهی ها در آب. It's love, free love making. And then in Fath Baq, she really puts the nature to shame of this thing. She becomes not an Eve, but a Lilith, if you will. That's the woman that Adam had and did not appreciate because she was assertive and expressive, and she was his equal, whereas Eve was the kind of obedient wife in a way, except for that transgression which both of them committed. So in a way, through these legends, and if you want to leave God aside to his own devices, you see the rise, development, and eventually, hopefully in the future, the demise of patriarchy that speaks through these things. And also this whole deferment of joy to another realm, another world, another existence.
Well, thank you very much, Ahmad. My colleague, Dr. Anshbar Daimi, has had a look at the questions that came in from our web viewers and had a look there and chose one of them for the time being that I would like to put to you, namely from Fatemeh Shams from Oxford. So we say hello from Manchester to Oxford. And so she thanks you very much for the insightful talk and also greets your claim and not only a claim but actually a call for an avoidance of reductionist approaches that are informed by politics and shahs and wazirs and the like. But still she is mentioning that things change, as you of course yourself indicated with the rise of the Safavids and the territoriality coming in. And she's very much interested in the relationship between literature and ideology, and also makes an interesting point. She wants to hear what you have to say about the a rise of official literature in authoritarian regimes. And she makes reference to scholarship that exists in regards to Soviet and Chinese and post-war German literature.
I see the two questions are almost the same. Ideology and propagandist poetry. And mind you, in one way, I think almost all poetry carries some sort of ideology. The difference is in the degree and in our readerly diagnosis of whether something is sincerely felt or is really put out there to make us buy something or love something that we don't need, or thinks that we need something that we don't need to have, all kinds of ways. Ideology is not just political, in other words. Sometimes I think, and I've said this to my students back in Maryland, that really, in one sense, the modern 21st century poets are the Madison Avenue people, the guys who make us buy a particular cream or tie or whatever brand of something, right? Because they use persuasion. They persuade us in ways. So persuasion is one way of doing it. Perhaps when Nasir Khosrow talks about his Ismaili, he speaks from the depth of his heart. And so his propagation of that faith is not insincere or only a matter of verbal acrobatics, but it's a way of expressing something that's heartfelt. And perhaps that's the ultimate measure. You cannot take, Fatemeh is right, you cannot take ideology out of literature. You can only be so subtle about it as to not as to have your reader not even notice it, be affected by it without thinking that you're selling something to him or to her or her. When it passes a certain threshold in being forced, then it becomes ideology, Soviet ideology. And there's so much poetry that was written in German, of course, in German at the time of Hitler, comparing Jews to vermin and so on and so forth. It's poetry. Some of it is good poetry, but it's very harmful poetry. Neither poetry nor language nor the human mind is innocent, ladies and gentlemen. All of us are implicated. All of us are polluted. It's just how do we separate those things that we really cherish in our own hearts, even though it may not be someone else's belief, and those things that we know and knowingly lie about in order to produce a certain effect and a certain action, in this case, let's say purchasing something.
I think that is the perfect remark on which to close. Once again, thank you very much, Ahmad, and a round of applause for you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming along. Thank you very much to our web viewers. And I hope to see you all again next week for the 15th of May for our next lecture, which is back in the series on the interface between Russia and Iran.